Pontius Pilate, Judas Iscariot, Caiaphas, and Herod Antipas. Remember these names because they were central to one of history's most pivotal events. These are the people who executed Jesus Christ. Now, you might wonder, whatever happened to them after that infamous day? Well, their stories didn't end at the crucifixion. As the tension in Jerusalem grew with the arrival of the Passover, so too did the turmoil within Judas Iscariot. Amidst the fervor and chaos of the crowded city, Judas found himself wrestling with a turmoil that surpassed even the bustling streets around him. It was during this tumultuous time that he made a decision that would echo through eternity. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, Judas slipped away from the group of disciples and made his way through the narrow, shadow-laden alleys of Jerusalem. His destination was the residence of the high priests, where the air was thick with plots and whispered secrets. There, he met with Caiaphas and other members of the Sanhedrin, the air tense with anticipation and the gravity of the moment. The high priests, long troubled by Jesus' growing influence and controversial teachings, saw in Judas a surprising but welcome opportunity. They promised him 30 pieces of silver, a sum that, while modest, represented a fortune to a man of Judas's standing. The coins clinked ominously as they were placed into his palm, sealing his betrayal and setting the course for the events to come. Judas's agreement was simple yet devastating. He would lead the temple guards to Jesus, away from the crowds that might protect him, ensuring a quiet arrest under the cloak of night. The plan was set, and Judas left, the weight of the silver in his pocket matched only by the growing heaviness in his heart. As he returned to the disciples and Jesus, who were resting in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas's demeanor had changed. The others noticed his distant, distracted manner, but none could fathom the decision that churned within him, a decision that would soon unravel in the quiet garden under the soft light of lanterns and the watchful eyes of the moon. The spark of betrayal was lit, setting in motion a chain of events that none could halt. Judas's actions that night would not only lead to the arrest of Jesus, but would also forever mark him as history's quintessential traitor, his name a byword for betrayal for centuries to come. The night air was cool and still as Jesus and his disciples retreated to the Garden of Gethsemane after the Passover meal. The garden, an oasis of tranquility on the Mount of Olives, was about to become the backdrop for a pivotal scene in this unfolding drama. As the disciples struggled against the weight of sleep, Jesus ventured deeper into the garden to pray, his thoughts heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Meanwhile, Judas, now a figure shadowed by betrayal, navigated back through the dark streets, his mind a tumult of regret and resolve. He was not alone. With him, a band of temple guards and some officials sent by the chief priests, all armed and ready for confrontation, moved silently towards the garden. The clink of their weapons and the soft murmur of their voices broke the night silence as they drew closer to their target. As they entered the garden, the soft glow of lanterns and torches cast eerie shadows among the olive trees. Jesus, returning to his disciples, found them asleep, gently chastising them for their inability to stay awake during his time of greatest need. It was then that the quiet of the night was shattered by the approach of the armed group, led by Judas, stepping forward with a resolve that belied his inner turmoil. Judas approached Jesus. The traditional sign of greeting, a kiss, was now a signal of utmost betrayal. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said as he kissed Jesus, the signal to the guards of whom to arrest. The chilling act was met with a mix of confusion and dawning horror by the disciples. Jesus, ever composed, addressed Judas, "Friend, do what you came for." His calm in the face of betrayal added a profound gravity to the scene. The guards, upon this cue, stepped forward to seize Jesus, their hands firm and unyielding. The disciples, now fully awake, reacted with a mix of fear and outrage. Simon Peter, in a burst of protective fury, drew his sword and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. But Jesus immediately rebuked Peter and healed the servant's wound, demonstrating his commitment to peace and fulfilling his earlier teachings about non-violence. With Jesus in custody, the guards led him away, his fate sealed by the kiss of a friend turned betrayer. The garden, once a place of quiet reflection and prayer, had become the scene of one of the most infamous arrests in history. After being led away from the tranquility of Gethsemane, Jesus found himself in the midst of a hastily convened assembly of Jerusalem's most powerful religious leaders, the Sanhedrin. The high priest Caiaphas presided over this nocturnal trial, a gathering that bent the rules of Jewish law, which typically forbade trials during festival periods and at night. The atmosphere inside the chamber was thick with tension and anticipation. Caiaphas and his associates were determined to find a cause for condemnation that would satisfy both their religious laws and the political need to present Jesus as a threat to Roman order. False witnesses came forward, their testimonies conflicting and failing to meet the requirements for a conviction. The frustration in the room mounted as the early hours of the morning ticked by without any solid grounds for a death sentence. Pushed to his limits, Caiaphas stood and directly addressed Jesus, who had remained silent throughout the accusations. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God," Caiaphas demanded, seeking to force Jesus into a statement that could be deemed blasphemous. Jesus' response was forthright. "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." This declaration was all Caiaphas needed. Tearing his clothes in a dramatic gesture of outrage, he accused Jesus of blasphemy, a charge that under Jewish law warranted death. The room erupted in chaos, with many members of the Sanhedrin shouting their agreement. They mocked Jesus, struck him, and spit on him, displaying a contempt that went beyond legal proceedings into personal vendetta. The trial, if it could be called that, was a foregone conclusion, driven by fear, envy, and the threat Jesus posed to the established religious order. As dawn approached, the Sanhedrin reached a consensus. Jesus would be taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, for the final verdict, as only the Roman authorities could sanction an execution. This move shifted the venue, but not the venom. The religious leaders were resolute in their drive to see Jesus crucified. As dawn painted the Jerusalem skyline with hues of gold and crimson, Jesus was bound and led through the still sleeping streets to the Praetorium, the residence of Pontius Pilate. Pilate, who had likely been awakened for this unusual early morning trial, was an experienced administrator known for his pragmatic approach to governance and his disdain for Jewish customs. However, this case would prove to test his judgment like no other. Upon receiving Jesus and the accusations brought against him by the Sanhedrin, Pilate listened to the charges of blasphemy, subversion, and claiming to be a king, charges that challenged Roman authority. Pilate, sensing the tension and the high stakes involved, initiated a private conversation with Jesus, seeking to understand the nature of his kingdom and his claim to kingship, asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus' answers were enigmatic, focusing on the spiritual nature of his kingdom, stating, "My kingdom is not of this world." These responses perplexed Pilate, who struggled to find any legal basis for the charges under Roman law. Pilate's discomfort grew as he faced the dual pressures of a hostile Sanhedrin and his own wife's unsettling dream about Jesus, which she recounted to him in a plea for his caution. Returning to the crowd, Pilate publicly declared, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." However, the chief priests and the assembled crowd were relentless, inciting more accusations and demanding execution. Pilate, seeking to avoid a riot and maintain public order during the volatile Passover festival, attempted a political maneuver. He offered to release Jesus as part of a customary pardon, expecting the crowd to choose Jesus over Barabbas, a known insurrectionist. To his dismay, the crowd chose Barabbas. Frustrated and seeking to absolve himself of responsibility, Pilate performed a symbolic act of washing his hands before the crowd, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." Despite this, he handed Jesus over to be flogged and then crucified, caving to the pressures that surrounded him. Pilate's involvement highlighted a profound reluctance and a complex interplay of justice, power, and expediency. His decision, fraught with political implications, set the stage for the final act of the crucifixion, marking a crucial turning point in the narrative where Roman and Jewish interests collided with tragic consequences. After Pilate discovered that Jesus hailed from Galilee, he saw an opportunity to rid himself of this problematic case by sending Jesus to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem at the time for the Passover festival. Herod, the Tetrarch of Galilee, had heard much about Jesus and was intrigued by the rumors of his miraculous powers. He hoped to witness a miracle firsthand, viewing Jesus more as a curiosity than a criminal threat. When Jesus was presented before Herod, the Tetrarch greeted him with a mix of eagerness and mockery, questioning him at length. However, Jesus remained silent throughout Herod's interrogation, offering no answers nor performing any miracles. Herod's fascination quickly turned to frustration, and then to mockery. Disappointed by Jesus' refusal to entertain or enlighten, Herod and his soldiers scorned him, dressing him in an elegant robe as a way to ridicule his claim to kingship. This act was not just a personal slight, but a political statement belittling the idea of a Jewish king under Roman oversight. Despite his mockery, Herod did not find any guilt in Jesus that warranted death. Seeing no value in executing him, but unwilling to release him outright, Herod opted to send Jesus back to Pilate. This decision was a political maneuver that served to rid Herod of a political problem without alienating either the Jewish authorities or his Roman overseers. It also marked a rare moment of agreement between Herod and Pilate, who had been at odds before this incident. The mutual handling of Jesus' case served to reconcile the two rulers, forging a bond over their shared dilemma. Herod's role in the narrative is pivotal in illustrating the complex political dynamics at play and the personal caprices that influenced the events leading up to the crucifixion. His involvement underscores the indifference and mockery faced by Jesus in the final hours before his death, adding layers of humiliation and suffering to the ordeal. After the brief and inconsequential encounter with Herod, Jesus was once again brought before Pilate. Despite his earlier declaration of finding no fault in Jesus, Pilate succumbed to the escalating pressures from the crowd and the religious leaders. In a final attempt to appease the public and avoid further conflict, Pilate ordered that Jesus be scourged. The brutal flogging was intended as a compromise, a severe punishment that might satisfy the crowd's thirst for justice without proceeding to execution. However, the crowd, manipulated by the chief priests, remained insatiable. Pilate, in a last effort to provoke their sympathy, presented Jesus to them after the scourging, beaten and crowned with thorns, saying, "Behold the man!" Yet their cries only grew louder. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate, politically cornered and unable to quell the growing unrest, finally relented. He handed Jesus over to be crucified, marking one of the most poignant moments of judicial surrender to mob rule in history. The procession to Golgotha, known as the Place of the Skull, was a harrowing march. Jesus, weakened severely from the scourging, carried his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem. The path was lined with mourners and onlookers, some weeping, some indifferent, and others hurling insults. The weight of the cross and the torment of his injuries brought him to the ground repeatedly. Amidst the crowd, a man named Simon of Cyrene was compelled by the Roman soldiers to carry the cross for Jesus, sharing the burden of an ordeal he had no part in. This act, while a relief to Jesus, highlighted the cruelty of the Roman practice of crucifixion, where even bystanders could be drawn into the suffering. As they reached the summit of Golgotha, the stark reality of what was to come became evident to all who watched. The crucifixion process was brutal and meticulous, with Roman soldiers driving nails through Jesus' hands and feet, affixing him firmly to the crossbeams. Above his head, Pilate had an inscription placed which read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," a title meant to mock both Jesus and the Jewish people, yet one that spoke to the truth of his claims in a way Pilate perhaps did not fully understand. The crucifixion of Jesus stood as a grim spectacle of suffering and an emblematic moment of sacrifice, watched by a mixed multitude whose emotions ranged from sorrow to satisfaction. As Jesus hung there between two thieves, his final words and actions would continue to echo through the annals of history, shaping the foundation of Christian belief. Upon reaching the crest of Golgotha, the stark, barren landscape under the midday sun set the stage for what would become the defining moment of Christian doctrine. Jesus, exhausted and in severe pain, was laid upon the cross, and Roman soldiers carried out the grim task of nailing him to the wooden beams. As they raised the cross, the crowd's mix of jeers and wails filled the air, a haunting soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. As Jesus hung suspended between heaven and earth, his figure became a focal point of profound grief and contemplation. The soldiers cast lots for his garments, fulfilling ancient prophecies even in their acts of cruelty. Below him, various groups reacted to the spectacle with differing emotions. Some of the religious leaders mocked him, saying he saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. Others, including his mother Mary, close disciple John, and a few devoted followers, stood at a distance, their hearts breaking in silence. During the hours that Jesus hung on the cross, the sky unexpectedly darkened, as if nature itself mourned his suffering, or the world recoiled at its own deed. This supernatural darkness covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour, creating an eerie and solemn atmosphere that intensified the spectators' fear and awe. Jesus' interactions with the two criminals crucified alongside him further highlighted his unique character and mission. One of the criminals hurled insults at him, echoing the mockery from below. However, the other criminal, recognizing Jesus' innocence and divinity, asked to be remembered in his kingdom. Jesus' response, "Truly I tell you, Today you will be with me in paradise," offered a glimpse of hope and redemption amidst the grim proceedings. In his final moments, Jesus uttered several profound statements, including, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," which underscored his forgiving nature and divine mission. His last words, "It is finished," spoken with a loud cry, signified the completion of his earthly mission and the fulfillment of scriptural prophecy. As Jesus gave up his spirit, the ground shook violently, and the veil of the temple, the barrier to the Holy of Holies, was torn from top to bottom. This event symbolized the removal of the separation between God and humanity, a theological cornerstone for what his death was meant to achieve. The immediate aftermath of the crucifixion saw a mix of reactions, from the centurion proclaiming, "Truly, this was the Son of God," to onlookers returning home, beating their breasts in sorrow and confusion. The impact of this day resonated deeply, setting the stage for the events that would follow, including his reported resurrection, which would offer the ultimate proof of his divine nature and mission. The impact of the crucifixion rippled through the hearts and minds of all who had played a part in it, particularly those who had actively sought Jesus' death. As the earth shook and the skies darkened at the moment of Jesus' passing, a sense of dread and realization dawned upon many, especially the religious leaders and Pontius Pilate. Judas Iscariot, already tormented by his act of betrayal, felt the full weight of his actions as news of Jesus' death spread. Overwhelmed by guilt and despair, he attempted to return the 30 pieces of silver, seeking to undo his deed. When the priests rejected his attempt at restitution, declaring the money tainted, Judas's isolation and remorse became unbearable. In a secluded field, he took his own life, ending his torment in a tragic culmination of regret and sorrow. Pontius Pilate faced his own reckoning. Although he had attempted to wash his hands of the responsibility, the events that followed haunted him. Reports of the supernatural occurrences at the time of Jesus' death and the persistent claims of Jesus' innocence by various factions troubled him deeply. Pilate's governance was increasingly questioned by both his Roman superiors and the local populace, leading to his eventual recall to Rome, where he faced obscurity and possibly an ignoble end. Caiaphas and the other Sanhedrin members also grappled with the consequences of their decisions. The tearing of the temple veil was seen by many as a divine sign of displeasure with the high priesthood and its actions. Over the subsequent years, Caiaphas found his authority under scrutiny, both from within his own ranks and by the growing Christian community that cited his role in Jesus' death as proof of his failure as a spiritual leader. Herod Antipas observed these events with wary interest. While he had mocked Jesus and failed to stop the crucifixion, he was alarmed by the reports of unrest and supernatural events following Jesus' death. His rule continued to be characterized by political maneuvering, but his involvement in Jesus' trial added a layer of historical infamy to his reign. The concept of divine retribution, that justice from a higher power can manifest in response to human actions, resonated deeply in the aftermath of the crucifixion. The eerie coincidences and significant life changes experienced by those who played roles in condemning Jesus have been interpreted by some as manifestations of this cosmic justice. Pontius Pilate, whose rule was marked by an uneasy balance of authority and pragmatism, saw his career and reputation unravel shortly after the crucifixion. Ancient sources and later Christian traditions suggest that Pilate suffered misfortune in his later years, including possible banishment and a mysterious end. Whether these were coincidences or divine retribution remains a topic of historical and theological debate, but they certainly underscore the precarious nature of his decisions and the lingering impact of his reluctant role in Jesus' death. Caiaphas, as high priest, faced a direct challenge to his authority, not just from Roman overseers, but from the growing movement of those who followed Jesus. The tearing of the temple veil, a symbol of the barrier between God and the people, was interpreted by early Christians as a sign of God's disapproval of Caiaphas's actions. His eventual removal from the priesthood can be seen as a culmination of the loss of legitimacy, both spiritually and politically. Judas Iscariot's end is perhaps the most directly linked to the idea of divine retribution. His suicide, driven by remorse and despair, is often seen as a personal judgment against his betrayal, serving as a stark lesson on the consequences of betrayal and greed. Herod Antipas experienced a decline in his political power and was eventually exiled, an outcome that some might attribute to his moral failings, including his role in mocking Jesus. Herod's fate in exile adds to the narrative of downfall following grievous moral errors, reinforcing themes of justice and retribution. These stories of downfall and disgrace following the crucifixion do not just serve as historical footnotes. They weave a complex tapestry of moral lessons and theological reflections on the nature of justice and retribution. They suggest that the actions of these figures had long-reaching spiritual and worldly consequences, echoing through history as warnings and lessons on the power of choices and the reach of divine justice.